Welcome to Old Path Ministries and our study through the book of 1 Samuel. We get to chapter 26. We have 6 chapters left before the end of the book, and we'll probably be able to do it in 2 parts. We'll just kind of see how it goes. But what we have in front of us is there are some odd things that we'll look at in this. One that maybe many of you are familiar with, because what Saul does in consulting a medium really kind of begs a lot of questions. So we'll get to that in due course. That's obviously going to be the last chapter that we take care of today. But what we look at in these chapters is still the continued animosity that Saul has towards David, and the fact that he wants to see him dead, and really the things that it ends up causing, and where David winds up. It's, just again, the intrigue of all of this. And I keep asking myself, as I read through these things, and I have, every time I think about this, God lets this kind of all play out. And so the exact amount of time from when David first fell out of favor with Saul until now, it's pretty hard to tell exactly what it is, but it's been several years. That way we can pretty much know what that is, and where David runs from the Philistines or to the Philistines as a way of protecting himself against Saul. We get that here, that lasts for a year and 4 months. So it's kind of a self-imposed exile, but he does it for preservation's sake. And here we'll have another instance where he has the ability to take Saul's life, and refuses to do it because of the integrity of his heart. But there is a lot of intrigue in this when you look at it. And again, it really is only brought on because of one reason. And that was because though God did not want Israel to have a king, they chose one. They chose poorly. God allowed them to have that person, warned them in advance about it. You can read that in chapter 8. And yet they're having to deal with the consequences of it because Saul is just a madman. And clearly he's done so many horrible things. It's clear that God is very much done with him. And it's going to take a very odd occasion in chapter 28 to make that abundantly clear to him. And really it is at the end of his life. So chapter 26, let's turn there. And before we look at the text, let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you. As we come to you and as we examine your word, we pray, God, that we would learn the lessons that we might be able to learn from history. It's good for us to know the history of what happened in the nation of Israel, and even in the time of the kings. It is not a way of your choosing when it comes to governing your people, and yet you are there with them in the midst of it all. We pray, Father, that we would understand whatever we can from this history, making proper application to ourselves, because we see how you do deal with your people and how you move things into place. We ask, Lord, that you would help us in our understanding of this time and of this book. And we ask it in Jesus' name. All right, so chapter 26 says, Now the Ziphites came to Saul at Gibeah, saying, Is David not holding in the hill of Hachilah opposite of Jeshimon? Now, as I've said to you before, there are a lot of place names that we'll get when we look at the text. Some of them we know, and other ones they speculate at them. Some of them they just flat out don't. It's probably worth, if you don't do it anyway, you're able to watch this on YouTube, I would assume, or either that or on our website. And if you're doing so, then a simple search of the internet, you can find these maps. And so there are so many times, if I keep throwing up maps on this, it's going to just take up more time than is necessary. But what you might want to do, if you haven't already had the time to do so, get kind of just a folder on your computer. If you're able to watch this using a computer, I know if you're using phones, it might be a little bit more difficult. But when you can, it's always good to have at your disposal a bunch of maps of these places. That's assuming you're interested in the geography of this. But what you have in the areas that are being spoken of here, where David was, is kind of to the south. And remember, he had been driven to the south of Jerusalem because of Saul's madness. And this is the second time that this same group of people that are mentioned here, the Ziphites, have come to Saul, recognizing that David is in their territory, and they want Saul to do something about it. Again, there's all kinds of speculation. Why did they have seemingly such a problem with David? Did they just see this as maybe a way of trying to get some kind of favor from the king? Did they just feel endangered by having these men, David and his men there? There's a lot of speculation. We don't know for sure, but this is now the second time that they've done it. The last time, what we know, because there is controversy in this, shouldn't be. It's typical people trying to cast doubt on the Bible, because this is the same group of people in chapter 24 that had gone to Saul before, and Saul came down, and David pushed further into the wilderness, more towards the east, and Saul was about to encircle him and probably would have finished off the deal that he wanted to of killing David, and then he gets that report that the Philistines have come into the land, so he has to stop his pursuit of David and go encounter the Philistines. What we're going to see here in chapter 26, none of that happens this time around. It's a totally different outcome. Everything about it is different. So this is usually where the typical liberal academics look at the Bible and say it's just a bunch of stories, and they're mixing them up, or they're trying to reuse the same old stories, when you can just look at the text and know that the details are so different other than just the geographical area. And for whatever reason, the axe that they had to grind with David, the Ziphites, come again to Saul. So with all of that said, we do have what is kind of a very similar thing to what happened when David went into the cave at En-Gedi. Now, let's remember that when we think about that whole episode, that is right on the shores, or it's in the foothills just above the Dead Sea. So it's much more to the east, and it's much more in the lowlands. This is not that. This is much more to the west. This is up in the mountainous region. This is up above sea level. So, when people try to just say it's the same rehashed stories with just a little bit difference, no, Saul was that crazy, and David was that much in despair and trying to get away from Saul. These are just different occasions with somewhat different outcomes, but the same motivation. Saul wanted David dead. Whenever he had what he thought was intelligence, we would call it, where he might be, he makes his way down there to try to kill David off. And of course, David is able to escape from his hands. And on the second occasion, we'll read here in chapter 26, he has the ability to take Saul's life and refuses to do it for the same reasons he refused to do it the last time. Though he gets counsel from his guys, here's your chance. You can finish him off. Okay, that's all the backdrop. Verse 2. So Saul arose, went down to the wilderness of Ziph, having 3,000 chosen men of Israel with him to seek David in the wilderness of Ziph. Now, I will put up I have already put up the map of this at the beginning of this, so you can refer back to it if you need to. Back up the video. Hopefully you screen captured it, as I had mentioned before, because this does kind of take place all in this area. Saul encamped in the hill of Hakilah, which is opposite of Jeshimon by the road, but David stayed in the wilderness, and he saw that Saul had come down after him into the wilderness, and David therefore sent out spies and understood that Saul had indeed come. So you could see it from a distance, knowing that they're there, but not knowing the extent of it. So he sends out spies. David arose, came to the place where Saul had encamped, and David saw the place where Saul lay, and Abner, the son of Ner, the commander of his army. Now Saul lay within the camp, and the people encamped all around him. So he's insulated here. And that's done by design, clearly. The king is, if you're going to get to the king, you're going to have to go through all of his people. So really what you have in this kind of a case, he's the king. There is, of course, all of the people that would be there to guard him. Certainly they would have sentries. Certainly they would have people on watch. No one would go to sleep. They wouldn't go to sleep as one person. There would be some of them who would have to stay awake for the security of the camp and of the king, right? Under normal circumstances, but read on. So David answered, and he said to Ahimelech the Hittite, and to Abishai the son of Zeruiah, the brother of Joab, saying, who will go down with me to Saul in the camp? And Abishai said, I will go with you. And so David and Abishai came to the camp by night, and there Saul lay sleeping in the camp with his spear stuck into the ground by his head, and Abner and the people lay all around him. So the whole group of them is there. So they're, doesn't seem as though they're intense. They're outdoors, and there's Saul's spear stuck in the ground. And then you'll see what else is there. So Abishai said to David, God has delivered your enemy into your hand this day. Now therefore, please let me strike him at once with the spear right to the earth, and I will not have to strike him a second time. So basically, let me go ahead and put the spear in the ground again, but let me get Saul's head in the process, and I won't have to do it a second time. Pretty serious stuff here. But again, remember, by this time Abishai realizes, look, Saul's going to wipe us out if he gets the opportunity. Why don't we take this opportunity and do this ourselves? So he sees the opportunity. This is very similar to the kind of thing that had happened before at En-Gedi. But remember, in case those people would say, oh, it's the same occasion, they're just dressing it up a little bit. It's just garbage that people would say that and they can't look at the scripture for what it says. Remember, that was Saul in a cave where David and his men already were. In this case, they're all asleep. And there's some detail that we're going to get here that David comes to them by night, but God is in this whole process here so as to bring these things to pass as they did. Well, so then David says to Abishai in verse 9, do not destroy him, for who can stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? So this is a kind of a wonderful way of basically exposing this truth. As long as Saul, though God has removed his favor from him, he's still alive, and the people see him as the king. And though David realizes that he has been anointed the king as well, he sees himself alive at the same time as Saul. What he basically is saying here, and just kind of the implied part of this is, look, if God hasn't taken him, then God's not done. And David says as much here in just a moment. But by what he says to Abishai, who is it that could do what you're talking about doing and then stand before God and say, I'm justified and what I've done is okay? God did not give him instruction to go and to do that. And I'm so thankful for David. Though there are those times he's made plenty of mistakes in his life, he will. Still at this point, he doesn't take these matters into his own hands, especially in these kinds of circumstances. Was he a fleshly man when it comes to, the whole Bathsheba thing? We're going to be reading about that in the next book. Of course, he does all of those kind of things. So he's not a perfect man, not by a long shot. But when it comes to these matters and him wanting to do what's honorable before the Lord, it's really a pretty amazing thing. He's kind of a case study in that. So he asked the question, how can someone do this and then stand before God guiltless? So then David said, furthermore, as the Lord lives, the Lord shall strike him, or his day shall come to die, or he shall go into battle and he will perish. So David's point is, this is for God to determine. It's not for us to determine. God hasn't sent us to do this thing. It'll be that God will do. David said to Abishai, again, furthermore, the idea in verse 10, as the Lord lives, the Lord will do this. Very, very important. So this is clearly has been from the beginning. As soon as this problem between he and Saul first started, David has always been of this same mind. This is for God to deal with. Boy, much broader application. Boy, if we could learn this one, let the Lord do what the Lord's going to do. Don't take matters into your own hands, and certainly don't do something of major consequence unless you know that he's the one giving direction. So doing what seems right to our own eyes is just a bad idea. We learned that from Judges, remember? All right. Now, verse 11, the Lord forbid that I should stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed. That's speaking about the king. But please take now the spear and the jug of water that are by his head and let us go. And so David took the spear and the jug of water that were by Saul's head, and they got away. Now stop and don't read anything else. When we read this, of course, this just makes you think, kind of ridiculous. How is it that David could have possibly gotten into the camp? How would he get past the people who were supposed to be holding, guard? And how is it that he and Abishai could have a discussion with all these people laying around and Saul right in front of them without anybody knowing? How is that possible? Just the idea that it's kind of ridiculous. So, of course, the skeptic would probably say something like that until they read the rest of the verse. Read what else it says. So they got away, and no man saw or knew it or awoke. Why? For they were all asleep, because a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen upon them. Great. So God sets all of these things in motion. Now, really there's not much of Saul's life that is left here. So basically it is probably done as much for everyone else to see this rather than just for Saul, because we realize by the time that we get into the next couple of chapters, Saul is he doesn't have it together. This is a guy who doesn't care about the things of God. We see that clearly. He plays a good game sometimes just by his lip service, but clearly his whole life and his actions show a completely different understanding than that he's caring about the things of God. This is a very, very deeply disturbed man. So David went over to the other side, stood at the top of the hill afar off, a great distance being between them. And David called out to the people and to Abner, the son of Ner, saying, do you not answer Abner? Then Abner answered and said, who are you calling out to the king? So again, it's just the way that the English puts this, but it's David calling out to Abner first of all. Now, of course, Saul's going to hear about this as well, but it's to get people's attention. Now, remember, when it comes to En-Gedi, as far as En-Gedi was concerned, the place that they were was basically inside of a canyon, and it looks down into this to the Dead Sea. And I realized after last week's study, I was supposed to put up some pictures of this. Once again, if you're watching this, contact me through the email, because I can send them to you in email. They didn't make it into the video, and I apologize for that. But the canyons at En-Gedi are pretty confined. So even in those canyons, if the way that it's laid out for us, if it was that when David called out to Saul and said, take a look at your robe, and he's got his piece of it that he had cut off, if Saul's men wanted to pursue David, they probably would have been pretty easily able to overtake them. If David, we would understand that the cave was more by the road, so it would appear as though Saul and his men went further up into the canyon, but there's really nowhere to go. If you're David, especially if you were up in the canyon, there's definitely nowhere to go. If you're in the lower part, all you can do is run out into flat land. And you would think that sooner or later, Saul's men would be able to overtake them. But God, intervenes in that whole thing. And Saul, for a very short time, relents from it. We're going to have a similar situation here. Saul kind of relents. Now, where David is would give him much more of an ability to kind of escape, and yet still what Saul has is a pretty formidable group. They're basically his select, best of the best kind of mercenary type, soldiers. He had 3,000 of them with him. So it never comes to that point clearly. So he calls out to him. Then David said to Abner in verse 15, are you not a man? And who is like you in all of Israel? Why then have you not guarded your lord the king? For one of the people came in to destroy your lord the king, and the thing that you have done is not good. As the Lord lives, you deserve to die, because you have not guarded your master, the Lord's anointed. And now see where the king's spear is, and the jug of water that was by his head. Now, it's kind of an interesting thing, because he really puts Abner on the spot here, yet as far as Abner is concerned, it was God who put him to sleep. Now, is David doing this as kind of just a way of mocking? Is it a way of just, kind of provoking? Is it just kind of more David just saying, how did you allow something like this? There's speculation as to what it means, but at very minimum, it puts Abner in a pretty awkward place as far as Saul is concerned. They don't know why they slept through the whole thing. And now here's David calling out and basically saying, I could have taken Saul out yet again. It would have the impact of this. Once again, David is able to get right next to Saul, and he takes two things that make it clear that he stood right next to Saul. I've got his spear and the pitcher of water that was by his head, and none of you guys knew it. This is David's way of saying, yet again, I could have done something that never should have been even possible. So, depending on who's listening to the whole thing, Abner's going to take it as a personal offense, I'm sure. The men around would have to say, how did none of us see this? And maybe start to ask the questions. Maybe the Lord is doing something here in this. Kind of interesting. So, verse 17. So Saul knew David's voice, and he said, is that your voice, my son David? And so David said, it is my voice, Lord King. And he said, So why does my Lord thus pursue his servant? For what have I done, or what evil is in my hand? Now, this is a question that David has asked before. Because once again, there's no reason for this hatred that Saul has. It's not that long ago that David had the whole episode there at En-Gedi, and they had come to that same understanding that David had said, who am I? I've never done anything wrong towards you. Look at who you are in your group of men. Look at me, who I am, basically a dog, a flea. And so why is there this problem? And he's going to use that same kind of reasoning yet again with Saul. So he said, why does my Lord pursue his servant? What have I done, or what evil is in my hand? Now therefore, please let my Lord the king hear the words of his servant. If the Lord has stirred you up against me, then let him accept an offering. But if the children of men, may they be cursed before the Lord, for they have driven me out this day from sharing in the inheritance of the Lord, saying, go and serve other gods. Pretty heavy statement here. So what David's point is, look, if there's something that I've done wrong, let me make some kind of an adjustment. Let me do what needs to be done. It's not as much the sacrifice like we would think of, offering up a lamb and everything else. In fact, the word that he uses here in the Hebrew gives more the impression about, let me do something to make it right. Let me offer something to correct whatever offense I may have offered towards you. But if it's someone who is saying things wrongfully about me and putting problems between you and me, then let that person be accursed. Let that person let them be cursed before the Lord. We see in verse 19, he says, because here's the end result. It has driven me to a group of people outside of the inheritance of Israel, and I'm having to walk and live among people who are godless and who don't recognize the inheritance that I have as a man of Judah, as a man of Israel, of that tribe of Judah. It's a pretty serious matter, as they would understand it. It's a land that God had given to them, and because of the things that basically are left for Saul, you determine, Saul, but here's the end result. I've done nothing wrong, and I'm cut off from my inheritance to live among the heathen. It's a pretty compelling thing. Verse 20, so now do not let my blood fall to the earth before the face of the Lord, for the king of Israel has come out to seek a flea, as when one hunts a partridge in the mountain. So I'm nothing compared to you, King Saul. You have the people, you have the resources, you have all of these things. I have none of those, and I offer you as no threat. Here again, second time I could have taken your life, but I would never stretch my hand out against the Lord's anointed. I would never do that. It's this integrity that he has. Well, so once again, just like what we saw in chapter 24, Saul said, I have sinned. Return my son David, for I will harm you no more, because my life was precious in your eyes this day. Indeed, I have played the fool, and I have erred exceedingly. So even in this, Saul doesn't recognize it. You played the fool this day? No, you've been playing the fool for years in this. Out of your petty jealousy and your own paranoia. He's done some pretty insane things. We're going to get to that in the next chapter. But actually in the 28th chapter really gets into some crazy stuff. But it just shows how he has put himself in this position. Saul is the one who is precipitating all of this. David is the person who's just trying to determine, why do you do the things that you do? Well, David answered and said, well, here is the king's spear. Let one of the young men come over here and get it. So there's some suspicion, it would appear, on David's part. It's like, okay, you've said this before, but basically your hollow words. I'm not coming to, I'm going to return to you. I'm not putting myself in that place. I'm going to leave your spear and your pitcher right here. You send one of your guys over to get it. So, verse 23, may the Lord repay every man for his righteousness and for his faithfulness, for the Lord delivered you into my hand today, but I would not stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed. Now, isn't this an interesting thing? Look at how verse 23 starts again. May the Lord repay every man for his righteousness. Implied in that, and those for their unrighteousness. Let God be the one to determine the motivations, the actions, and everything of every man who is here. Wow. Now that, again, that really kind of throws it out there that people can't just plead ignorance or say, I've just happened to be here. Everybody is kind of at the place of accountability at this point. So let the Lord decide who is righteous in this matter, starting with David and Saul, but really does extend to everyone else. I believe that application part of it, because the people are hearing this. This is an out loud discussion between everybody in earshot. So it's more than just two people. So David is able to say, I would not strike the one that God had anointed. Now, again, let's make sure we are very, very clear on this. Saul has heard from Samuel that you are not going to remain as the king, that God has removed his presence from you, his blessing from you as being the king. Though he's still alive, God does not move through him as king. In fact, he's really not doing that much through David either, because David has been outcast. So there really isn't a man leading the nation in a godly sense at this point. And the resulting effect is pretty obvious here. But David does this thing and just makes it one of those things. Let the Lord determine. So, verse 24, indeed, as your life was valued much this day in my eyes, so let my life be valued much in the eyes of the Lord, and let him deliver me out of all tribulation. What an amazing thing. So notice what he says here. At the first part of it, indeed, your life was valued in my eyes. So I have acted towards you. Now he's not saying, therefore you act towards me. David says, I've acted kindly towards you. Now may the Lord act kindly towards me. Takes Saul completely out of the equation. Interesting, huh? So he says to him, your life was valued much this day in my eyes, verse 24. And so let my life be valued much in the eyes of the Lord, and let him deliver me out of all tribulation. Then Saul said to David, may you be blessed, my son David. You shall both do great things, and you will prevail. The literal Hebrew word here is you will vanquish. So David went his way, and Saul returned to his place. So David did not go with Saul. But Saul, even at this point, you can see this. Sometimes he would get these glimpses of just lucid thought. So he basically looks at this, and this is, numerous attempts by this time that Saul has made against David twice in this area, and had not been able to pull it off before. He had another attempt, or was making an attempt at En-Gedi. So there are multiple occasions where Saul, under normal circumstances, should have prevailed. And yet God keeps delivering him out. So Saul finally has to recognize these two things. Notice he says he's going to do both these things. Great things. Not only is he going to do great things, but he will also both. He will not only do great things through you, but you ultimately will prevail. You're going to vanquish. And that has a way, how much of this Saul really realized, but the thing that Saul wasn't able to do will be seen in the person of David. And that is subduing the enemies all around. And so during David's time, that will take place. Now, chapter 27, this still shows that even with all that has taken place, David is still not able to live among the people. So what you see here is just really kind of an interesting thing. Again, it's got to be God intervening to some extent. Because remember, this is, as far as the king is concerned that he's about to go to, this is a Philistine king. This is the King of Gath. He's done this once before. If you remember, he's come to Gath before and tried to, try to get protection. And when they start to really look at him kind of weird, David starts acting like he's insane, drooling from the mouth and all that stuff. And he's able to go away because the king says, look, I don't need crazy people around me. And they let him go. But remember, this is the same group of people that were affiliated with Goliath, and David had killed Goliath. So you remember, the people didn't want David anywhere around. They hated him. Now here's David yet again after the whole incident with Saul, and he sees this as one thing. If David is able to get there, it would really keep Saul from wanting to come against the Philistines. It's a pretty daring wager, if you will, because David really puts himself in harm's way. Now, how much of this is the Lord's leading? Clearly, God has his hand upon David, but it just launches right into it. This is what David goes and does. We don't have any kind of detail. Did God really instruct him to do this? However it may be, if nothing else, you could say God backs his play in this, and that he keeps him and that he prospers you'll notice that he has ulterior motives for what he does too, because he's acting as a king would act, yet he's among the Philistines, and you could see it by his actions and the things that he does. And so let's just read into it, or just read it rather, so that I'm not narrating the whole thing. Chapter 27. David said in his heart, "Now I shall perish someday by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me that I should speedily escape to the land of the Philistines, and Saul will despair of me to seek me any more in that part, or in any part of Israel, so I shall escape from his hand." Now, here is a part where David, because it doesn't give any impression that this is what God's leading to. Here at this point he says, Saul's going to kill me. Okay, we can maybe see that this is somewhat of David just, I mean, it's got to be depressing, it's the despair and everything else. But here's one of those things, we really, of all people, because of our understanding, let's remember, we're the church. We're 2,000 years after Jesus has died and resurrected. So the outcome of things is never in doubt to the believer. To David, it should never be in doubt. Remember, by this time, David knows Saul has tried to kill you numerous times and you've always escaped. Samuel has told you directly that Saul is done, you're the king. It would really lead David to never have to say something if he genuinely understood it and really believed it, that verse 1 of chapter 27 should have never happened. I'm going to die at the hands of Saul. How is that possible, David? You're the king. And now God will, at some point, finish the task with Saul. David, you've even said it with your own words. It's the Lord who's going to have to do this. It's not up to us. The Lord's going to take Saul at some way, at some time, but that's up to him. So it's almost contradictory what David says here. Now again, is it just said as an expression of frustration, weakness, all of the above, whatever it is? It's an interesting thing, but it does definitely show, for all of his wisdom, at this point you see David has kind of fallen into a bit of just what is very much human despair. So he says this. Now, of course, it leads him to go live among the Philistines, which is crazy. So David arose, went over with his 600 men who were with him, and he went with him to Achish, the son of Maoch, the king of Gath. So he's been with Achish before. Now, what he's going to do when he's there, you're going to see, verse 3, David dwelt with Achish at Gath, he and his men, each man with his household, David with his 2 wives, and verse 4, and it was told to Saul that David had fled to Gath, and so he sought him no longer. So David's wager was correct. If I go there, Saul's just going to leave me alone. Why? Well, not because he wants anything less from David, but in order to get to David, he's going to have to go through the Philistines in their land that they had, that they were controlling. He's not about to do that. Now, again, just as a little side note of this, it shouldn't be their land. The Philistines shouldn't be there. That is land that was given by promise all the way back to Abraham. Saul being a man of Benjamin, and David being a man of Judah, and the rest of Israel, there shouldn't be a Philistine in the land. They should have been driven out. Along with the Amalekites and all the rest of the ites, they should have all been gone. Why? God said so. Get them out. It'll take a while, not going to do it all in one piece, but you're going to drive them all out. And we know the reasons why. They were idolaters, and because of that idolatry, they infected the people of Israel, and they caused them to play, as the Bible likes to use the term, to play the harlot against the Lord. And that means in the spiritual sense. That means going after someone else that is not yours. So in this case, it's just, again, the intrigue of even God doing things through godly people, yet you see the flesh just comes in all too often. Boy, isn't that still the case today, even with us? Well, verse 5 rather. So David said to Achish, "If I have now found favor in your eyes, let them rather give me a place in some town in the country, for that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the city, in the royal city, with you?" Now, it sounds like a very humble thing, but you can see David really wants no part of living in the proximity of Achish. What he'd rather have is something that's going to be much more, as you'll see, it's, if you look on a map, it's much more to the west. it allows him to do some pretty interesting things that we see clearly. The things that he does is to the benefit of Israel, because he goes after the people that are all to the south. And the more that David is able to inflict damage to those people to the south, the more he is able to safeguard Israel. And he does it by, collecting a lot of things and a lot of tribute and whatnot, or not tribute, but spoils of war, brings them back to Achish. Now, Achish is loving this, and so he sees David as this plunderer who's bringing him all of these riches, while David's really securing the southern portion of Israel on behalf of his country. There's no other explanation for it, because he doesn't like Achish. Achish is a pagan man, and David is of course no friend of that, because remember, wasn't this the same David who, when he heard Goliath say, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that would mock the armies of the living God?" Basically, I'm going to take this guy out. These are the same people. They haven't changed. David hasn't changed. David is just kind of, if you will, biding his time, and at the same time using that as cover to do the things that he does in the south. It's really, to me, that's an implied thing, or I can see it by implication, because there really isn't a better explanation other than that. He does this because it's to the benefit of Israel. So Achish gave him Ziklag. Therefore Ziklag has belonged to the king of Judah to this day. Now, the time that David dwelt in the country of the Philistines was 1 full year and 4 months, as I had mentioned earlier. So it's not just a few weeks. This is a prolonged amount of time. So the problems that existed between David and Saul really kind of went on for years. So again, God just really honing the man David, kind of stripping him of anything that might have been. This will certainly take away your pride and teach you some humility, but meanwhile, there's some pretty interesting things that God has to do with Saul as well. So David and his men, they went up and they raided the Geshurites, the Girzites, the Amalekites, for those nations were the inhabitants of the land of old, to go to Shur, even as far as the land of Egypt. So everything to the south, right? So David is in that part of the country. Remember, Gath would be, as you're looking at it, again, go, if you don't have them, go grab maps. There's really good ones out there, and some of them, if you ever decide to buy them, buy some Bible atlases and stuff like that. They're very inexpensive online, and they're really kind of cool. You're able to see a lot of things. But in this case, David and Gath and all of that part, it's not in the northern part of the country. So David is not running to the north of the nation, because that's outside of the Philistines' land. Where David is able to do the things that he's doing for, and seemingly for, the Philistines is to the south. It's a place where he's able to do what he does, and God uses him to subdue those parts. So whenever David attacked that land, he left neither man nor woman alive, but he took away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, and the apparel, and he returned, and they came to Achish. In return, he would come and bring them to Achish. So they would wipe the people out, and then take all the things that would sustain civilization and bring them back to the Philistines. Now, you might find that this is not such a great idea, because now you're just strengthening the Philistines. Well, whether David just realizes this or not, God's going to end up giving all of that stuff to him anyway, because the Philistines are going to be, really kind of put in a place of subjection to him eventually. So the idea of weakening things to the south makes perfect sense. He has the ability to do so. He does it. There's a long game that's being played here. And how much of it David really knows, or how much it's just that God puts that into his mind to do, he's really ultimately kind of serving to do what God had said they were supposed to do from Joshua's time. Come into the land, disperse the nations that are here, because God's judging them. So you can see that by David's hand, God is furthering the judgment of the people of the land for their wickedness, their idolatry, their paganism, and he's using David to do it while David is waiting for God to finish out the things that he's doing with Saul. All right, so verse 10. Achish would say, "Where have you made a raid today?" And David would say, "Against the southern area of Judah, or against the southern area of the Jerahmeelites and against the southern area of the Kenites. And David would save neither man nor woman to bring news to Gath, saying, lest they should inform us of one saying, thus David did, and thus he was his behavior all the time. So it was basically this idea, let's not leave anyone alive to give a different testimony other than the one that David had given. So there does seem to be a kind of, David clearly had ulterior motives and didn't want that making it back to Achish. What he's looking for here is a way that Achish would think, David serves me and serves me alone. And look at what he does. He goes and seemingly it would appear to Achish that David is keeping his southern flank, safe, and he's bringing back all the spoils, and he didn't want anybody bringing a different reason for some. Seemingly there are things that David was doing that was more beneficial to him and to Israel than it was to Achish. So David received from, Let me read verse 11 again. I looked at the wrong part of the page. Verse 11 of chapter 27. David would save neither man nor woman alive to bring news to Gath, saying, lest they should inform on us, saying, thus David did, and thus was his behavior all the time that he dwelt in the country of the Philistines. That don't bring back a second, a way of a different narrative than what David was giving to them. So Achish believed David, saying, he has made his people Israel utterly abhor him, therefore he will be my servant forever. So David is able, as God is working out the other things, everything looks like he is serving Achish when David is actually looking to secure the land of Israel. That's why he would basically, when he would come back, it's not, I'm always taking care of the things of Judah. I'm taking care of things in the south, whether they be in Judah or more even in the place of where the Philistines control. So now chapter 28. Let's go into this a little bit. I don't want to rush through this because it's very, very important that we understand what has happened with Saul. Let me think if we can do this. Because it really kind of, let's get into the first part of it. I'm looking at the time and do I want to save this for the next study? Because it really is, it's hugely important. There are some theological questions that come along with this, because it is something that God would not ordinarily want to honor. This is, many of us know, this is the Witch of Endor. This is where Saul basically creates a situation where he's left with no option other than to go to somebody who's a medium, a spiritist. I'll tell you what we can do is we can take the first 6 verses here, and then we can review them just a little bit when we get to verse 7 on, because it is, once again, Samuel is going to make an appearance of some sort. We're going to have to look at all the different options that are explained in this, and I think we need to try to at least ask, and hopefully we're able to answer some questions of why would God allow something like this. And it's clearly against what he would want done, but it's also clear that the woman who is doing this is quite surprised by the outcome. So it is way outside the norm of what she's used to, or so it would appear. So I know it's a lot of, I'm going to get your mind thinking about it if you haven't heard studies on this before, but I don't want to rush into it. In chapter 28, let's just we'll take the first 6 verses, because it'll help set up for where we are next week. Verse 1 of chapter 28. Now it happened in those days that the Philistines gathered their armies together for war to fight against Israel, and Achish said to David, you assuredly know that you will go out with me to battle, and you and your men. So David said to Achish, surely you know what your servant can do. And Achish said to David, therefore I will make you one of my guardians forever. Now, isn't it interesting that David does not answer his question? He just basically says, you know what we can do. Doesn't say what we will do, doesn't pledge his allegiance to him. But this would put David in a pretty odd place. Is David really going to fight against his own nation? You can't imagine that he would. He doesn't refuse to do it, because what would that do between he and Achish at the point? He can't do what I'm sure is in his mind, and that's he can't defect to Saul. But I can't see that he would really want to fight with his own men. It seems as though he's kind of biding his time, and we're going to see that God intervenes in this. So what we know, they're ready to go fight against Saul. By this time, again, Saul still is to the east and the north of where Gath is. But the Philistines want to come against Saul where he is, to the north of Israel. And this is an area that we visit when we're in Israel, not only the place where the Philistines gathered, but also where the battle finally happened. Everything that we're about to read is something that we are able to see with our own eyes, because the areas are still there. Some of this happens in what we would call the Valley of Armageddon, the Jezreel Valley. So again, take a look at your maps and look at kind of the proximity of where these places are. Now, here's what happened. Verse 3. This is just kind of a little parenthetical. The big picture, chapter 28 begins with this. The Philistines are ready to engage Saul. And this will ultimately lead to the last of Saul's life. He dies in this battle, as we see at the end. And so we're towards the end of the book itself. But this little parenthetical part, this will show you that Saul's irrational, the things that he did have led to this point where he's not going to survive it, because he's just clearly out of his mind. So, Achish tells David, I'm going to do this. David says, you know what we're capable of. Achish says, I'm going to make you one of the people who is a guardian to me. Keeps him very, very close. Samuel had died by this point. We all know that. All of Israel had lamented for him. They buried him in Ramah, in his own city, and Saul had put the mediums and the spiritists out of the land. Now that's past tense. That was one of the things that he had done. When he was doing what he had supposed to have done, he had made it an outlawed thing. Clearly, though, what we're about to find out, because he talks with this woman of Endor, they had made their way back in. So it gives the impression that there was a time when when Saul would have made sure that all of the people who were practicing paganism among the nation would have been driven out. Well, because clearly he's not walking rightly before God, stuff started to come back in. It's becoming corrupt yet again. And it was an open secret, if you will, because when he asks for somebody, they're able to find a woman for him to talk to, somebody who could conjure up the dead, as they would think. Remember, according to the law, such people were to be put to death, according to the law of Moses. And so Deuteronomy and those places, when God said, if you've got those people among you, you don't just tell them to stop, they're to be put to death, because they're consulting familiar spirits. Okay? So by this time, again, Samuel had died, he had been buried. The Philistines gathered together, and they encamped at Shumnan, and Saul gathered all Israel together, and he encamped at Gilboa. Now, again, if you're looking at a map, you'll notice the Jezreel Valley runs from kind of north to south, but it runs west to east. So it runs in a diagonal like this. At the head of that, we would think is, or we would imagine, is really where you see of Carmel, and where we know from Elijah and the prophets and all that stuff. But it runs down this way, and it runs all the way down and even past what is the Jordan River. So Jordan River is 700 feet roughly below sea level at around this area. So the valley runs downhill, and it runs in this direction as you're looking. So Saul is kind of down well into the far reaches of Israel in that part. Gilboa is very much to the south, very close to the Jordan River, and where we're going to find that where the Philistines ultimately go, they're kind of in the upper northern part of the north, the southernmost portion, going up towards the north at a place that we also love to go and see, which is called Ethek. This is where they get together, and they're going to meet down in Gilboa in that direction. We're going to see that as it all lays out. So this just kind of tells us where they are and where they're all assembling. Now, verse 5 says, now when Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was fearful, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. So when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams, by the Urim, or by the prophets. Now, that might not seem like a whole lot when you first hear that, but remember something, because it's very, very important at this point. There is no real priests, or whatever's left is a far cry from what it should have been. He killed them all. Remember that? So if he's trying to inquire of the Lord through the priesthood, there are none around. Whatever prophets there are, Samuel's dead. What kind of prophets were there at the time? We're not told, but they're not going to be very, very helpful. He doesn't have any priests around to use the Urim, which is the way of, the lots that God would be able to talk. God has already removed his presence from him. So Saul's in this really weird place where God is done with him, not speaking to him, not giving him counsel, not answering his questions. But remember, it's a self-imposed problem here because Saul killed all of the priests, and Saul is in a place of total rebellion against God. So, of course, he's not going to hear from him. Now, there's the debate that goes on for the people who think through this that much. If Saul had been at this point where he had said to the Lord, I'm not hearing from you, and obviously it's not you're not the problem, God, I'm the problem. I can't go to the priests because I've killed them. I've offended you and I've killed these men. I'm a murderer. And if he had thrown himself on the mercy of God and said, I need to know what I need to know. I don't want to go through some other way. God, would you speak to me? There's in this place nowhere where we see that there's repentance. He does all the formulaic stuff that he's probably familiar with. Whatever's there or whoever's there to talk to, God's not speaking. He's not speaking in dreams. He's not speaking through the Urim. He's not speaking in any of the traditional ways. Again, it's not God's problem. It's your problem, Saul. You caused it. So instead of just trying to come to some kind of an understanding, how do I get God to speak to me again? He just goes, I'm going to go back to the Spiritists. I'm going to go back to the pagans. Maybe they can get an answer for me. And think about the irony of that. God's not speaking to me through godly terms. Maybe I can get him to speak to me through pagan terms. I mean, how twisted is your logic when you're getting to that point and thinking that somehow that's acceptable? But such is the life of Saul at this point. So this sets the table for us. We'll get into chapter 28. We'll do that next week. But it tells us that really the forces are being put together for the final battle that will ultimately end up taking Saul's life. What we're going to find before those things take place is God's going to intervene yet again for David, not because of Saul. And the whole of the matter is going to be kind of known to Saul in very, very short time. But I want to make sure that we take the time to look at this, that God doesn't want anything to do with speaking through the way that Saul is looking to do it, but he does seem to take the opportunity to go outside of what the woman thought she was going to do in the way of the pagan way of conjuring up spirits. And he's going to say some very obvious things to Saul that are going to be, of course, deeply, deeply troubling to him. So with all that said, let's pick it up next week rather than try to hurry through this. And we'll deal with what is known as the Witch of Endor and what happens and how God ends up communicating in this. So with all that said, we will pick that up, and then we'll get into chapter 29 at minimum. Maybe they're kind of shorter chapters. We may be able to finish off the book next week anyway. But for now, let's leave it at that. If you have any questions about what we've looked at, again, especially with maps, if you're unable to find maps and would like to have some kind of a better understanding of where they are, these places, then you can send us an email. I'll be happy to send them to you back on email. And if you're watching this on YouTube, then feel free to subscribe, and you'll have notifications of the content that we put up. If you're watching this on through the ministry's website, it is oldpaththeology.net. There is an email that is there. That's how you can contact us. We are grateful for any input, and we're grateful if you have questions that you ask them, because we love to be able to answer those. And we're so thankful that you join us every week through the Old Testament. We do those on Mondays. If you're watching this, we also do, and if you're not aware, we also do on Thursdays, New Testament, and we will always do that. Old Testament, if the Lord leaves us here long enough and I get through the minor prophets and I get to Malachi, we're going back to Genesis. We are at all times working through it. And the same thing in the New Testament. We go from the Gospels all the way to Revelation, and we'll start again. We'll keep going through it because the best way for the believer to grow in their understanding of God is to know him through the entirety of his word. From Genesis to Revelation, they are all on an equal playing field, and we don't remove any particular books of the Bible for any reason. We should know the full of God's counsel. So with that being said, we'll pick it up next week at verse 7 of chapter 28. And I pray that you take the time between now and then to read other places in Scripture and spend time with God and his word. It has such incredible benefit to us. So with that said, may God bless you, and we'll see you next week.